Thank you, Steve. It's nice to be with the president, even a former president, and particularly to share this podium with a dear friend, Saperstein, and with Leslie Weiss, who's given such great service, and to be here under the auspices of the AZM. Herbert Block has been a colleague going back to JDC, Joint Distribution Committee, 20 years ago, and I worked very closely with Richard Heinemann and Phyllis and his family on many activities, including March of the Living. It's a great tribute to the United States government, its people in general, and the American Jewish community in particular, that the United States government has been a champion for Israel and for Jewish causes, sometimes more visibly in the state of Israel. All of this when the American Jewish community is little more than 2% of the population. At the same time, it's important to recognize that as a global power, the U.S. has interests that do not always align with those of Israel or the American Jewish community. Let's first start with the reality of the United States as a global player, and I say this from having served in 4 administrations. It's unmistakably clear that the Roosevelt administration failed to act on clear evidence of the genocide of the Jews during World War II. This is both because of the lack of pressure at the time from American Jewish leaders, because of the prevailing high levels of anti-Semitism, and because of FDR's fear of losing public support for the war effort if it became seen as a war for the Jews. This came to my attention dramatically in 1968 when I was working on the Humphrey campaign, and a colleague, Arthur Morse, had just published a book called While 6 Million Died, which was the first documentary using newly declassified FDR records. And it was a shock to me and to much of the American Jewish community. For those of my parents' generation and grandparents' generation at the time, I said that they believed in 3 things: Die Welt, this world; Jene Welt, the world to come; and Roosevelt. And so it was a dramatic shock to learn this. And in fact, it was only in 1944, at the instance of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s report, initially labeled by the Treasury Department staff, and I served as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury years later, it was labeled the acquiescence of this administration in the genocide of the Jews. And while Morgenthau, realizing that FDR was up for a 4th term, changed the title, he didn't change a comma of the report. And it led to the creation, with Morgenthau as chairman, of the War Refugee Board, saving hundreds of thousands of Jews, particularly Hungarian Jews, working with Raoul Wallenberg. And just think, if that had been done years earlier, how many might have been saved. After the war, the Truman administration initially kept Jews in DP camps, which were so bad that his special envoy told him that Jews were being kept in conditions similar to those of the Nazis, only, quote unquote, we don't kill them. Moreover, the Truman administration did little to pressure the British to allow Jews into Palestine after the war from Cyprus, where some stayed for up to 5 years. In looking at U.S. policy over the decades toward Israel, it's important to recognize that from the perspective of any administration, there's one Jewish state and 22 Arab states, many sitting on some of the world's largest supplies of natural gas and crude oil. This obviously has an impact on U.S. policy. Truman courageously recognized Israel in 1947 over the fierce objection of his heroic Secretary of State, George Marshall. But during the 1948 War of Independence, he imposed an arms embargo against Israel at the time of its maximum peril, requiring Israel to get arms from the Czechs and the French. Defensive arms only began being supplied by the U.S. under the Kennedy administration, and offensive arms only under the Johnson administration, which was the first White House I served in. Every president, to one degree or another, has had significant differences with Israel. LBJ was a true great friend of Israel. And yet, over UN Resolution 242, there were differences calling for withdrawal from territories captured during the '67 war. During the Carter administration, there were very significant differences with the Begin government over settlements and the Palestinians, and over the Saudi arms sale in 1977 of F-15s, which led to a ferocious battle with Congress and the Jewish community. Likewise, in the Reagan administration, there was an equally ferocious battle over his sale of AWACS surveillance planes to Saudi Arabia. His criticism of the June 1981 Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor of Ozarek, and the attacks on the Sabra and Satila Palestinian camps. George H.W. Bush threatened to withhold aid over settlement expansion. In the George W. Bush administration, Secretary of State Condi Rice sharply criticized Israel's invasion of Lebanon and the Gaza war as well. During the Obama administration, there were differences over settlements and the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And even today, during the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which has to approve any foreign acquisition of U.S. sensitive companies and high-tech companies, Israel, and I say this from direct experience, has more difficulty with its companies acquiring U.S. high-tech companies than any other country other than China. At the same time, it is important to recognize the difference in the Kissinger-Nixon realpolitik. Golda Meir came and made a very impassioned plea on behalf of Soviet Jews. After the meeting, there is now a recorded transcript of a conversation between Secretary Kissinger and Nixon in which they agree that while Golda is a terrific leader, the internal politics of the Soviet Union are none of our business. Now let's look at the other side of the story, and that is the remarkable alignment of the U.S. with Israel and Jewish causes. One that is really historic between the world's most powerful democracy and one of its smallest, but yet most innovative. Let's go back again to the U.S. recognition of Israel in 1947. And while I mentioned that President Truman cut off arms to Israel in 1948, he withstood the threat of resignation of his Secretary of State, George Marshall, after whom the Marshall Fund was named, who was a war hero, general of the army, and recognized Israel only seconds after the UN resolution. In 1977, and I'm pleased I was a part of this, the Carter administration championed the Arab boycott legislation, barring U.S. companies from participating in the Arab boycott of Israel, over the objection of much of the American business community that said, and quite rightly, that it was going to be losing business as a result of that. In April 1978, I sent a memorandum to the President suggesting the creation of a presidential commission on the Holocaust chaired by Elie Wiesel, which he accepted, and accepted the recommendation, which has led to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Even though the majority of survivors lived outside the United States, and the U.S. role in terms of the liberation of the camps was more marginal. In addition, during the Carter administration, we championed the cause of Soviet Jews and of Sharansky as part of, and here I'm sorry, Steve, that our other speaker is not here, because it was part of an overall injection of human rights into foreign policy as part of a human rights policy that saw it as an avenue of competition with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the world, given its repression. And in July of 1978, shortly before Sharansky was being tried and falsely convicted, President Carter, at the instance of Avital and the Jewish community, made a remarkable statement which no president before or after has said, denying publicly that Sharansky, or no president's ever said about anybody else, was an American spy, and Sharansky, for all of his differences with Carter since then, has said this saved his life. More significantly, even broader than that, is that we championed, along with the Soviet Jewish movement in the United States, the rights of Soviet Jews to leave, the rights of refuseniks to leave, and reached a level of 50,000 at a peak before the Afghan invasion in '79. And President Reagan, to his great credit, with his pressure, increased Soviet Jewish immigration even more. During the Iranian Revolution in 1979, we specifically intervened with a special visa status, which permitted those young Iranian Jews in the United States from being expelled and sent back along with other Iranians, and ultimately led to 50,000 Iranian Jews, Baha'is, and Christians leaving the clutches of Ayatollah Khomeini. During the Clinton administration, at a time when the Israeli government didn't raise a finger to champion the cause of Holocaust survivors, the Clinton administration empowered me to negotiate what turned out to be $8 billion of U.S.-led negotiations with Swiss and French banks, German and Austrian slave labor companies, European insurers, and communal property restitution. I began this episode when I was ambassador to you in 1993-94, when I made initial visits to Belarus and other countries in the former Soviet Union, and my first stop was to enlist the support of Israeli ambassadors. After all, Israel is supposed to be the state of the Jewish people, not just a Jewish state. They didn't want in any way to help because they didn't want to interfere with the bilateral relations of those countries. It was on our shoulders to negotiate $8 billion of recoveries, significant percentages of whom live in Israel and around the world. A great tribute to the U.S. government as well as to President Clinton. Through Republican and Democratic administration, there has been remarkably strong support for U.S. military aid and the closest intelligence cooperation with any country other than a very few English-speaking countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The intelligence cooperation with Israel is real-time, it's extensive, and the defense support for Israel takes up almost half of the entire military budget. During the Obama administration, following up on the George W. Bush administration, the Iron Dome system was created. And it cannot be emphasized enough that at a time when budgets are being cut right and left, that the only budget that's sacrosanct in this building that you're in right now is the military aid budget to Israel. Now that's a remarkable situation. Why? Why in this instance and in the others that I've mentioned has the U.S. taken the cudgels to support world jury, creating an institution like David's that he'll talk about to combat anti-Semitism and promote religious freedom in the State Department? I think it's for a number of reasons. The first is the kind of Jewish political activism that did not exist during World War II. We all kept our heads under the foxhole. And we learned a terrible lesson from that. And the signs we see on synagogues all over the country, never again, stimulated us in the Soviet Jewish area and stimulated us to support Israel. The donations that we give to members of Congress and to presidential candidates, the overall political activism far outweighs the 2% total population that we have. We calculated during the Carter administration that 35% of all the giving to the Democratic National Committee came from Jewish members. More broadly, however, if that were the only thing, it wouldn't work. There is something much more important that undergirds this unique relationship. And that is the Israel we know as a bulwark of democracy and a sea of autocrats, a pro-Western, pro-American country during the Cold War and now, forming partnerships against radical Islamic terrorism, but also for a very significant portion of the non-Jewish population in the United States, it's the Holy Land. Something very important for the evangelical movement as well. Now, my one admonition is that that support can be weakened, including in the American Jewish community, if Israel is seen to act against Jewish values and diaspora interests. I happened to be in the cabinet meeting for 2 hours at the end of June with Dennis Ross and Natan Sharansky, when the Prime Minister pulled back on the agreement to permit egalitarian prayer at a portion of the wall, Robinson's Arch. And this led to a devastating situation in which, at the very time of that decision, Sharansky's Jewish Agency Board was meeting and canceled its dinner with the Prime Minister. A delegation from AIPAC came to express concern. There's a religious conversion bill which would give a further monopoly to religious establishment, not simply to bar non-Orthodox conversions, but Orthodox conversions, if you're not on their preferred list. Now, there are 14.5 million Jews in this world today. There were 17 million in 1939, and a world population of 7 billion. We have got to unite together. And one of the things that I'm most concerned with, Israel can handle with the United States its external enemies, and God knows it's got them. 100,000 rockets from Iran facing Israel, and many other threats. But we must not let internal divisions weaken us. We must recognize that we have so much more in common, and that truly united we stand, and divided we are threatened. Thank you.